Hey everyone, welcome back. Thank you for joining me again. In the last video, I started uncovering the deception that's all around us, which runs deeper than most people even realize. And right now, we're living in Satan's time of deception when he's working overtime to blind, distract, and control the world one last time. So in this video, I'm continuing to expose the things that he's doing, the way that he's shaping what we see, what we believe, and even how we live so that we can stay alert, grounded, and connected to the truth. So we're going to look at how entire systems were shifted away from simple, natural ways of living. Things like sunlight, water, herbs, and sound, and redirected towards centralized man-made solutions that create dependence and constant expense. It helps to step back and see the big picture because not that long ago, families and communities used what was around them, such as the sun, clay, copper, herbs, water, music, as everyday tools for healing and health. And for them, that was just normal life. But then over time, those things were pushed aside and labeled as, quote, alternative, while pharmaceuticals, machines, and institutions became the new standard. And that change wasn't accidental. When a culture moves what gives life to the sidelines and replaces it with expensive, controlled systems, it affects everything. It affects our health, our spirit, and even our sense of community. And so today I'm going to walk you through how that happened, who funded it, what reports and institutions changed the way that we're taught, and how the same forces that turned medicine into a business also influence things like sound and healing frequencies, which I'll touch on. And beneath it all, there's a spiritual layer. And this is part of Satan's season of deception. Systems built to pull our trust away from Yahusha's design and toward man-made control. So by the end of this video, my hope is that you'll be able to see the full picture, how medicine, education, media, and even music were reshaped into tools of influence, and that you'll walk away with practical ways to return to natural health and spiritual alignment. And so we are going to go ahead and get started. Manipulation doesn't just happen on the surface, it's built into the structure of our systems. It's not just about what's sitting on a pharmacy shelf in the store or a few corrupt doctors here and there. It's an entire network that's working together. People that are funding, accrediting boards, licensing agencies, insurance companies, media, textbook, and hospital systems, and more. And once the rules inside that system change, everyone within it starts feeling pressure to go along with it. And that's how something that once seemed strange or wrong can suddenly become completely, quote, normal. So think about how it happens step by step. It usually starts with money and grants. So when schools accept the funding that comes with certain conditions, they're agreeing to teach whatever those funders want them to. And then that means that the next generation of doctors is trained with a limited, very one-sided view. And then comes the accreditation and licensing. So if a school doesn't teach the approved, quote, approved material, its students cannot get licensed. And then that's what they do to keep everyone in line. Next, you have insurance. And what insurance companies choose to cover determines what most people can actually afford. And finally, mass media steps in to reinforce that story. So repeat one version of the truth enough times and it becomes what everyone accepts as, quote, common sense. All of that created a ripple effect that slowly pushed out natural forms of healing, things like plant-based healing, copper and clay therapies, herbs, sound-based healings, things like that. And then these practices were written off as, quote, unscientific. And then over time, they stopped being taught. But calling something unscientific doesn't mean that it doesn't work. it often just means that it can't be patented or turned into a profit. And if something can't make money on a large scale, the system sees it as expendable. So as you listen, keep this in mind that the messages that we hear every day, whether it be on TV, any kind of media, our hospital bills, and even what insurance covers, they are not neutral. They are shaping what we think is possible, who we trust, and even how we define healing itself. So this was never about helping and healing people. It was about increasing the power and wealth of those that are wanting to be at the top. Okay, on to Rockefeller. A lot of you have probably heard about Rockefeller and associate him with oil. And John D. Rockefeller's story, it might have started with oil, but it didn't end there. In 1870, he founded the Standard Oil Company, and by 1900, he controlled about 90% of all petroleum production in the United States. His biggest customer at that point was the US government, go figure. And with that level of wealth and influence, Rockefeller wasn't content to stop at oil. He then saw an opportunity to take control of another massive industry, which would be the healing industry. And then as he built his empire, Rockefeller realized how deeply connected the major systems of modern life really were: fuel, chemicals, education, and medicine. And he saw that oil byproducts could actually be turned into raw materials for synthetic drugs. And then those drugs could be patented, mass produced, and sold on a massive, massive scale. So then if he could shape the institutions that taught and promoted medicine, he could also create the market for those products. Rockefeller began funding hospitals, research centers, and medical schools, but he didn't do that just out of generosity. His funding came along with strings attached. And schools that agreed to adopt specific methods and curriculum focused on chemical-based treatments and pharmaceutical approaches, and they received his money and his influence. So those that held on to tradition or natural healing methods, they were actually pushed out, they were left out, both funding and credibility. This shifted the medical world completely. Practitioners who had spent decades working with natural healing, using things such as herbs, minerals, sound, and other holistic practices, suddenly found their work discredited and their livelihoods threatened if they did not conform to this new system that they were creating. And through these financial pathways and the rebranding of, quote, progress, affordable community-based healing practices were slowly replaced with factory-made patentable drugs. And healing became an industry, one that treated symptoms, and not even all the time, instead of curing the root causes, curing, keyword. And with it came endless streams of recurring profit. And then over time, this shift didn't just change medicine, it shaped our entire culture. Dependency replaced stewardship. Prescriptions replaced prevention. Power that once rested in homes and communities was transferred into the hands of institutions built on control and profit. And John D. Rockefeller was tied to Freemason. He built the Institute for Medical Research, and created these different drugs and spent large sums of money to fund the General Education Board, which then influenced Congress and medical schools. And then, little side note here, fun fact, William Rockefeller, John's father, he worked as a traveling salesperson selling, quote, miracle pills. So he was a master con artist and pretended to be deaf and mute to manipulate the people into buying this miracle that did absolutely nothing. On to another individual involved, Abraham Flexner. The 1910 Flexner report was one of the biggest turning points in medical history, but the story really starts a few years earlier. In 1901, John D. Rockefeller founded what is known as Rockefeller University, originally called the Institute for Medical Research. And through it, he helped pioneer many new medical treatments, including vaccines, synthetic drugs, and antibiotics. Innovations that would launch the modern pharmaceutical industry. But Rockefeller wasn't just investing in medicine, he was reshaping it. He used his own money, actually, and his own influence to actively phase out the natural treatments and replace them with his new model of medicine built on chemicals and lab-made drugs. Then in 1902, he went even further, pouring a large amount of money, of his own money, into creating the General Education Board, which I just mentioned earlier. And Congress approved it based on misleading data. And since Rockefeller withheld key information from about his true motives, it caused Congress to approve it. The board gave him enormous control over education and medical training nationwide. Medical universities that refused to abandon natural plant-based healing methods were cut off from federal grants and financial support, and that set the stage for a complete transformation of how medicine would be taught and practiced in America. And this all led directly into the Flexner Report. Rockefeller partnered with Andrew Carnegie. Some of you might have heard that name before. And together they hired Abraham Flexner, an educator, not even a doctor or scientist, to evaluate medical schools across the country. And Flexner's task was framed as a study to, quote, improve standards, but in reality, it enforced their new agenda. The report's recommendation became the foundation for what we now recognize as modern medical system. And the Flexner Report, funded and guided by these powerful interests, emphasized laboratory science, chemistry, and surgical procedures, all fields that align perfectly with petroleum chemical-based pharmaceuticals. And then as this model took hold, the old ways that they used, the natural, that was all left behind. And traditional community healing methods, which did things such as herbs, they used herbs, they did clay poultices, used copper utensils, bowls, cups, things like that. Linen bedding, linen is very healing, and midwives. Those were all stripped from the medical education. And schools that followed Flexner's recommendations received generous funding. And those that didn't were left to just phase out, to die out. And the teachers who resisted were replaced. And then within a generation, medicine had been rewritten to fit a new industrial mold. So what looked like, quote, progress was really economic and political control. When funding, accreditation, and prestige all depend on one centralized system, that system becomes the gatekeeper. The natural healing was marginalized, and the new profitable medical industry rose in its place. One focused more on symptoms, the symptom management, rather than the actual true deep healing. Once medical schools and hospitals fully adopted the pharmaceutical model, other parts of the system quickly fell in line. The American Medical Association and other professional organizations began consolidating power, taking control over licensing, education, and what counted as, quote, legitimate medical practice. And then the insurance companies stepped in and strengthened that control by deciding which treatments they would and would not pay for. When insurance only reimburses certain types of care, it actually automatically limits people's choices, basically. and most patients can only access what their insurance covers, and that shapes the entire medical landscape. And one major and often overlooked result of this shift was the medicalization of childbirth. So for most of history, midwives and home births were actually the normal, good way of having a baby naturally that often led to very healthy outcomes. But as hospital births became the standard, everything was completely changed. The environment itself reshaped expectations. Hospitals rely on standardized procedures, pharmaceutical interventions, and importantly, products and services that can be billed. As a result, childbirth was transformed from a natural, community-centered experience into a managed medical event. So newborns began receiving routine injections and treatments, many containing synthetic or undisclosed ingredients, immediately after birth. And parents were just told that it was something that they absolutely had to do, as though they didn't have a choice, and that was their routine thing. So those babies had multiple, and to this day receive multiple injections. These early interventions didn't just introduce foreign substances into the new life, they also began the process of building long-term dependency on the pharmaceutical system itself. And then over time, the body becomes accustomed to that pattern, setting the stage for a lifetime of treatments, prescriptions, and medical follow-ups that keep this cycle going. So what began as a system claiming to protect health gradually turned into one that profits from ongoing illness and dependencies. Most cited examples of natural cures being suppressed is laetrile, and it is actually a compound derived from apricot kernels. It was discovered by Dr. Ernst T. Krebs, Sr. and Jr., and early lab tests on mice showed real promise in inhibiting tumor growth. But instead of being allowed to develop, laetrile became a political and regulatory battleground. The Rockefeller-controlled medical establishment forced repeated trials under conditions designed for those trials to fail, ultimately declaring the treatment as, quote, ineffective and effectively suppressing it from public use. They didn't want anything that was healing and curing cancer or any kind of diseases to come about, because they wanted to build their wealth off of these things and figure out a way that they could do it. Meanwhile, some of Rockefeller's own pharmaceutical medicines were linked actually to causing cancer. Yet, this system also allowed him to found and control the American Cancer Society, shaping the official narrative about what treatments were acceptable and safe. And this is a clear example of a pattern. And the pattern is when a natural therapy threatens powerful financial interest, or it doesn't have backing from the institutions in control, it gets caught up in lawsuits, heavy regulation, and public discrediting. Trials, lobbying, regulatory decisions, and media narratives frame these treatments not on their actual results, but on what keeps the system profitable and in control. So in the end, what could have been a real natural approach to healing gets pushed aside, which is another reminder of how money and influence can decide the rules of medicine. Okay, on to another influential person, Margaret Sanger. Population control and eugenics were very influential ideas in the early 20th century. Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood. Many of you have heard of Planned Parenthood in 1960 and advocated for birth control. And her movement overlapped with eugenics, ideas that tragically were considered mainstream in some circles at that time. Planned Parenthood was fully supported by Rockefeller, giving her programs both funding and influence. And legal decisions like Buck versus Bell in 1927 legalized forced sterilizations in some states, often without the patient's consent or even their knowledge of what they were doing to them. Over time, institutional recognition helped normalize these ideas. Public figures have received the Margaret Sanger Awards, public figures that you would recognize if you pulled up who received those, showing how honors and endorsements can shape public perception and legitimize a controversial history. And when big money and scientific authority work together, the effects can be huge. Decisions about funding decide which programs get built up and which ones get pushed off to the side. The end result isn't always about helping people. It's a system designed to control populations rather than giving individuals real access to reproductive health care and the information they need to make their own choices. Okay, there's a lot to unpack in this slide particularly. I'm going to include some things that relate to the last video I did with the cathedrals and healing. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on sound and somatics, which actually can get much deeper, but I'm just going to touch on it because it all relates. So Rockefeller's influence extended beyond medicine and education. It also shaped sound and music. So historically, shared gathering places and traditional music like cathedral bells, hymns, local melodies, they created harmonies that influenced mood, social connection, and well-being, just to name a few. These sounds weren't just for decoration. They were part of holistic health and community life, which again ties to my last video on the cathedrals and their true purpose for healing. As cultural production became centralized, sound became another tool of influence. Tuning might just seem technical, but even small shifts can make music feel calming or it can make a person agitated. And the Rockefeller Foundation and its partners helped shift the tuning standard from 432 hertz. Hertz are vibrations per second. Shift that to 440 hertz. Intentionally muting natural healing frequencies and replacing them with tones that actually produce stress and anxiety. Rockefeller aimed to eliminate anything that promoted natural healing. Sunlight, herbs, water, sound, and community practices and music as we're learning, so that people would rely on his pharmaceuticals and hospitals, increasing his wealth, his influence, and his control. So sound, like medicine and education, became a lever to redirect trust and dependency towards his industrial empire, because he knew that if he could change that frequency to cause anxieties and other things that could physically, mentally, emotionally affect a person, that they will then turn towards hospitals, towards doctors, and towards pharmaceutical drugs. And here's something that's very interesting. I'm not sure if some of you know, but our bodies are made of 65 to 85% are water. And water reacts to vibration. So we are affected by sounds, music, noises, things like that, our environment. And so, yes, we are profoundly affected, either positively or negatively, by sounds, words, and music that we listen to. And a gentleman named Masaru Emoto, a Japanese researcher, showed through experiments with water crystals that words and music can physically change the water structure, the harmonious sounds the really calm sounds produce orderly crystals, kind of like little snowflakes, really beautiful designs. While harsh, the music with the beats and things like that, are like the jarring music, it creates disorderly crystals. His studies are really neat. If you can take the time to look into those studies, it's really neat. And somatics is the study of visible patterns created by sound and materials like sound, water, or salt, which demonstrates the same principle. Structured frequencies bring coherence, while clashing frequencies can create tension. So again, if you could look up his studies, there's a lot of information there, and it's really neat how water is affected by music and the changing of the water molecules. So 432 hertz has traditionally been associated with soothing natural harmonics, and 440 hertz, the modern standard, produces more stress and unease, a shift that Rockefeller helped facilitate to create a more anxious and manageable population. Music, as many of you know, it shapes us wherever we go. It doesn't matter where you go. You could be going into a grocery store, the mall, it's in media, it's in movies, it's even in churches. Psalms and hymns in the Bible were meant to guide hearts towards Yahusha, but many modern, quote, praise and worship songs are actually designed to manipulate emotion and promote false worship. Something else to look into. Modern popular music often provokes emotion to tell a story, while classical instrumental music, piano music, tuned naturally, supports coherence and aligns our bodies and our minds. And the elites understood that music shapes emotions, behavior, and spiritual inclination. So controlling the frequencies was part of making cultures easier to influence. So looking at scripture, one of the major verses amongst many that tell us to stay away from these sorceries, this pharmakia, would be Revelation 18:23. And I'll go ahead and read that verse. And the light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore, and the voice of the bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and by your sorceries were all nations deceived. And then another scripture is Colossians 2:8. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Yahusha. So these passages together highlight the dangers of systems that manipulate people using substances, wealth, culture, and even sounds. And the Greek word for sorceries in Revelation 18:23 that I just read is actually pharmakia, and which is the root word of pharmacy. In ancient times, it referred to potions, drugs, and substances that could alter the body, influence the will, or even affect what people hear and feel. And today, modern pharmaceuticals, media, and engineered music reflect a similar pattern. And Rockefeller and his partners, they built a network of laws and institutions, including the Fed and the IRS, which protected their wealth and gave them enormous control over economic and social systems with very little accountability. And in many ways, this is a modern reflection of Revelation's merchants using pharmakia to deceive entire nations, just as Colossians warns against them being captured by hollow and deceptive philosophies. And cultural influence reshaped medicine, education, and sound. So what couldn't be sold or controlled was pushed aside, and what could be monetized was elevated. That is the system, but understanding it is what is very important in order for us to be able to resist it. Because right now we are living in Satan's time of deception, and it's more important than ever to be alert to the major ways that he seeks to control our minds, spiritually, mentally, physically, and emotionally. And we want to bring natural healing back into our lives. Sunlight, whole foods, exercise, herbs, water, and even sound, like we touched on. Practices that actually restore peace and calmness, keeping us connected to the Father and His Son. So it's very important for us to pay attention to what we allow in our environment, the words that we hear and speak, the music that we listen to, the environment all around us, really, and the habits that we keep. These small daily choices add up to real change and help reclaim the health and wellness that was actually meant for us. And scripture guides us in this. Romans 12:2 reminds us, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Revelation 22:2 says, and the leaves of the tree were for healing of the nations. 3 John 1:2 encourages, beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers. Isaiah 26:3 promises, you will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you. So keep seeking truth and focus on small practical steps in your life. So what you eat, what you listen to, and just the daily habits that you cultivate influence your spiritual, mental, and physical well-being. Real healing actually begins with your choices, and consistent, intentional actions will help restore peace, clarity, and alignment with Yahusha's order in a world that has long tried to pull us away.